So we are here tonight to hear from two leading voices in the climate justice movement, Maya Rose Craig and Tori Tsui. Maya Rose Craig is a 23-year-old British-Bangladeshi birder, race activist and environmentalist campaigning for equal access to nature, to stop biodiversity loss and climate change, and to ensure global climate justice, all of which she believes are closely interlinked. Maya Rose's memoir, Bird Girl, was published in 2022. In it, she shares the impact of her own mental health, of growing up with a mother affected by severe bipolar disorder. She also talks about how nature helped them cope as a family and how she found joy and her voice through birding. Tori Tsui is a climate justice campaigner and author. She's a senior advisor for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and climate justice lead for Brian Eno's Earth%. Her debut book, It's Not Just You, was shortlisted for the Wainwright Prize. It reframes eco-anxiety as the urgent health crisis it really is, and one that can be addressed by diversifying our perspectives and community-led practices. Welcome, both. Hi. Hello.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. I know how busy you both are. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to be here tonight. So we're going to explore kind of the subjects of mental health and through a climate crisis lens, and also talk about your campaigning work. And there's a lot of crossover between the two of you. If maybe I can't see Maya Rose as much, maybe we could pin Maya Rose as well. Maybe she could joint pin her. Yeah, so there's a real crossover in terms of kind of what you campaign on, and also you've got a Bristol connection. So this is 5x15 Bristol. So yeah, Maya Rose, you grew up in the Chew Valley, didn't you? And Tori, you came here kind of after you graduated. So I thought we could start with is there a favourite nature spot that you'd be happy to share with? Where do you like to go in or outside the city?
I feel like Maya should go first because
I can go
stomping ground.
Go for it.
I mean, I love Bristol because it is so green. I feel like I'm very patriotic about Bristol. I go to other cities and I'm like, it's just not as nice, is it? And kind of going into town and even just hanging out in, Castle Park or College Green, or like just having a green space to sit right in the city centre. I really appreciate that. But again, I'm super biased. I grew up just outside Bristol, so like the Chew Valley, the Mendip Hills. It's an area of outstanding natural beauty. I'm obviously very into birds, and it's amazing for birds. And it's only in the last year or two, I think they finally set up like semi-decent public transport links from the city out into the Mendips and Chew Valley Lake. So if you have a chance, I'd really recommend.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. It's so beautiful around there. And actually reading your book did really inspire me to kind of think, right, I need to do more trips and get my children into bird watching. What about you, Tori?
Yeah, I mean, to echo kind of what Maya was saying, like Bristol's just so spoiled for choice when it comes to green space, when it comes to access to the outdoors and nature. I do have quite a tender space that I love, and it ties really into the theme that we're speaking about today, because I spent many times in this park, I guess you could say, during the pandemic and when I was going through tough times. But plot twist, it's actually not really a park, it's a graveyard. And I just think that despite the idea of graveyards being quite morbid, they're teeming with life, they're really peaceful, they're absolutely stunning habitats for wildlife and local flora and fauna. So it's called the Birdcage, and it's in Clifton Village. And over the summer, the sort of like the archway just blooms into this beautiful sort of, like arch of green, which I adore. And it's my favourite place in Bristol, and maybe one of my favourite places on earth. It's very sentimental to me.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing that tip. Like, 'cause it's always kind of a tension between like wanting people to experience these places, but then also maybe not kind of, I don't know, giving them away. I live just next to a cemetery actually, and during the pandemic, it was really great to be able to access it. Yeah, so both of you talk about sort of nature being like a refuge, and somewhere that you can go to kind of regenerate. Maya Rose, you mentioned birding, so obviously we can't talk about nature and talk to you without asking you a few questions about birding. I understand that you're around your 6,000th bird. Is that right? you tell us a bit about?
Yeah, I'm always happy to talk about birds. I come from a family of bird watchers, and I kind of spent my whole childhood bird watching. And I think, I don't know, I guess as a child, I never really reflected on that. But kind of the older I've gotten, the more I've realized what a central part of my life and how much I actually rely on bird watching, including for my own kind of health and well-being. And it's something which I'm sure we'll get into in terms of my mum's mental illness, for example, that I always turn to for comfort. And so it's kind of, there's these two sides of it, but I think a lot of people who don't know any bird watchers think they're kind of these very chill, kind of meditative people as well. And most of them are kind of insane and like really obsessive and like really, really into it, which I guess
Really came out.
yeah, where the list side of it comes, which I slightly focus on less these days, as I think as I'm a bit older, I do appreciate kind of the quiet moments more versus when I was a kid. I loved that it was an adventure and there was like loads of things we needed to see, and we're racing all over the country looking for rare bird species. But I think even though that kind of relationship with birds has definitely changed over the years, and I've seen a lot of them on that journey, they're always I can't really see my life at any point without birds in them in some capacity.
Yeah, no, I really got that sense, first of all, like reading your memoir, Bird Girl. Just it was a real insight into the birding community. Like, and as you said, didn't realize that it could, it could be, it's not the whole thing, but like a competitive element to it as well. But yeah, your birds, as you say, are closely entwined with your family. And you just mentioned your mum. You write really movingly and candidly about what it was like to kind of grow up with the ups and downs of your mum's bipolar. You say that it was birding and all of the amazing adventures that you went on with your family were an attempt to keep your family together, body and soul. Would you be happy to kind of explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my mum's been mentally ill since before I was born, but she didn't actually get diagnosed till I was about 10 years old, which that's a whole different discussion with the mental health services in the UK. But I think partially because of that, we had to kind of come up with coping mechanisms to deal with something that we didn't really understand. And as a family who loved nature, and that was kind of anyway what we did to spend time together when things were difficult, it was like, right, okay, we're going to go bird watching. And that continued as my mum became more mentally ill when she was sectioned when I was about 10, about a year before she got diagnosed. My parents had actually already arranged this whole big bird watching trip in South America, and they had this very long conversation about whether or not they should go. And I think if they'd asked any doctor, they would have said no, but they decided they wanted to do it. And it was just this life-changing experience where, for me and my dad, but actually watching my mum, who had been extremely, extremely depressed for about a year at that point, just slowly transform. And it wasn't that it healed it, it wasn't that it fixed her, but she was someone who'd barely been able to speak when we started this kind of bird watching journey, and just spending time in nature. And I think bird watching can be very, very meditative because you have to use all of your senses all the time. You have to be very present. And I just saw how much it helped her. And I think that kind of really shaped my relationship with nature and the outdoors. And as an adult, even when, and I'm sure Tori can agree with this, things get really, really crazy when we do what we do. And especially, I think a lot of it's digital. And it's like this ridiculous thing where I love nature and I love talking about nature, but it's on my phone. And I think like that, I'm glad it got drilled into me at such a young age to kind of remind me to be like, no, it's time to go outside now. And I try and remember that at all times.
Yeah, Tori, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I completely agree with Maya. It's just such a dichotomy knowing that we live in a digital age where we often use our devices to communicate different campaigns or our passions for the natural world or climate. And when you find yourself kind of being glued to this other appendage, which is a digital device, which just feels like instant gratification and hits of dopamine, and it's extremely addictive, you kind of realize that you're not actually spending that much time outside at all. And so I find that there's, yeah, this double-edged kind of sword where you do find really like beautiful community from it, but there's also this edge to it where you're super sucked in, you don't spend time outside, and it can also really have a negative impact on your mental health. Like, especially, I don't know if you feel this way, Mai, but like as a public figure or as a spokesperson, being online opens you up to so much vitriol and so much abuse, especially as like a racialized woman, especially talking about, any form of justice issue. It it just opens you up to a barrage of hate, and that can be extremely bad for your mental health, unsurprisingly. But then there's also so much beauty to it, and it's like the people that you meet and connect with. So it's complicated. And I think that just really neatly summarizes the world that we live in. It's ways complicated and ironic and full
Yeah.
of contradictions.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about kind of the sort of personal toll that being so kind of awake to what's going on in the world and being activists can have. You mentioned the trolling there. That reminded me of something that was written that you wrote in Bird Girl, My Rose. I was really, shocked but not surprised that a 14-year-old girl writing about environmental and race issues would be kind of trolled by Americans. How did you deal with that? And what was that like to experience at that age?
Yeah, I think that seemed weirder in 2016 than it does now, probably. Uh, and I think in some ways the age was almost more helpful, and and especially I think maybe being on the internet less, and again, Tori might agree with this, is I think you have a very strong sense of self when you're younger, especially if you're the kind of girl who's going online to talk about things. So obviously it was upsetting, but I think it mainly just made me really angry. And I think I found it more distressing in terms of kind of a um indicator for where the world and the culture and politics was at the time, because it had just never been kind of seen as acceptable to talk to people, at least like, people that I knew, they were not interacting like that online with one another. And then suddenly it was these kind of not even anonymous, it was kind of people with their faces on their profiles coming and saying like really, really nasty stuff. And I don't know, like I think it did probably upset me, but more than anything, and I think the lesson I tried to take away from it at least was that I was at least going in the right direction. And I think kind of thinking about it like that has very rarely led me wrong since, because people, I don't know, the more mad people are, the more interesting the things you're saying are, I suppose.
It didn't stop you either. It kept you going, which I thought was amazing.
All of us, I think every single one of us that I know has dealt with so much nasty stuff online. And
Tori, you're nodding there.
yeah,
Have you experienced it?
Yeah, 100%. Everything from abuse threats to death threats to stalking, everything, you name it. And especially when I've been in a video that goes viral or have said something that people deem controversial, that's opened me up to so much abuse. And I can't name a single woman who hasn't experienced that online. And I say women because there are so many of us in the climate space. And with the current climate as well, with like the rise of mis and disinformation and misogyny and fascism, it's relentless. And it's actually partly why I've taken a bit of a step back from being as present online, which might come across as a bit ironic because I do still spend a lot of time online, but I'm very kind of intentional not to check a lot of messages now because it's just not worth it. Yeah, it's really tricky.
Is that so that's one of the mechanisms, like coping mechanisms that you discussed?
Yeah.
Is there anything else? Because I know you are really open about kind of your mental health, and which I think is really, really important, especially when you have a platform like you do. But so we were talking about burnout earlier and how does this sort of thing contribute to your burnout, would you say? And how do you know? What are the signs, and how do you protect yourself when you're experiencing burnout?
I'm in kind of a bit of a unique position at the moment And the reason why I say unique is because I contracted a chronic illness last year, and it flares up every time my body is run down or burnt out, which seems to be quite often these days. And as a result of that, it's kind of like my body's alarm bells going off, and that for me is usually a sign. But it's, the classic things like extreme fatigue, brain fog. I find that I retreat into myself quite a lot, which is a real telltale sign because I'm quite an extroverted person. And so when I am unwell and I notice that I'm cutting myself off from a lot of my friends, I'm like, oh, here we are again. But yeah, you're right. I've always been very open about my mental health, and I think to be vulnerable in that way can feel really scary for a lot of people. And it certainly felt very scary for me, but it was part of my lifeline. And I noticed that when I started talking about it a bit more, loads more people would come forward and say, like, oh, thank you so much for speaking about not only your mental distress, but also your distress in response to the climate crisis. Like, it's really liberating and really healing, because there's still so much stigma around it. And that sort of stigma, it can kill people. And I really feel quite strongly about just being really open about any form of struggle that I have. I'm a chronic oversharer. That's just who I am. And it's attracted a lot of like really beautiful energies and supportive people into my life who really believe in like the power of vulnerability and just looking out for one another and championing community care. Yeah, and I do think that when you open yourself up in that way, it gives other people permission to do so as well. And that's why I try and do it.
Thank you for that. My Rose, do you feel the same? Because I was just thinking when you were talking that there is a kind of a shared thread between you both as well. And so far as kind of at least part of your cultural heritage, there's a lot of stigma around talking about mental health issues, or at least like a culture of silencing. Like, my Rose, how did you feel about going sort of public about why did you make the decision to do it? We've heard from Tori. Why did you kind of talk about mental health of your mother?
I actually was really not unhappy but wary about doing it at first. I never talked to anyone about it ever the whole time through school. I'm not sure that any of my friends knew. And I wanted to write this book about how much I love birds and kind of the impact that they'd had in my life. And I started piecing it together, and I realized it literally didn't make sense without talking about my mum, and that terrified me. And I talked to her, and I'm thinking about this, would you even be comfortable? And she went, yeah, absolutely. And I want you to be honest, and I want you to tell the full story. And she said that she had never seen herself or anything even similar to her story anywhere ever, and she wanted it to be like that for other people. And I think some of the best things I can hear about Bird Girl is kind of people saying that it has reflected their experiences or helped them understand family members struggling with mental illness. Or I do quite a lot of work with Bipolar UK, and people say, just saying it's helped them reconcile things in their own lives, and that's incredibly important to me. And I don't know. I think I just spent such a long time kind of really scared of talking about it and feeling like no one would understand, and it just being this massive part of my life that like I said, never told anyone about. But it was kind of terrifying. I'm sure Tori can agree, but you kind of write a book and then you forget that people are actually going to read it, and then suddenly it's and there's like a pile of books, and you're like, oh my god. So it was a lovely writing process. And then I went to my book launch, and there were like hundreds of these books, and I was like, people are going to be reading all of these. Like in the end, and it worked out so well, but I had this like fresh wave of terror, I guess. But people have only been very kind and very positive about it, which is all I could really.
Yeah, both of your books are amazing, so I'm not surprised. But yeah, I can imagine that you might have felt like just a bit nervous and exposed kind of initially.
Oh my gosh.
But I guess
100%. Thank you so much
nervous.
for sharing that, Maya. It's like, it was exactly what I was thinking. I was like, I'm writing this book in the comfort of my own house, talking about some really vulnerable things, listing out all of these different things that people have tried to diagnose me with, like all sorts of disorders and mental health conditions that I never made sense of. And now, however many years later, I'm like, oh, I realize I'm just really neurodivergent. And that's kind of how my relationship with mental health has manifested in the last few years. And I was at first quite nervous about putting out a lot of the stuff because it's literally like, I don't know, 3 pages in, and I just list out all of the mental health struggles I've ever been through. And I've had strangers who have read this, and I've had people that I've met who are like, oh, I can't wait to read your book. And I'm just like, okay, sure. And
Yeah.
at the same time, like, it's daunting, but it's been so liberating because all cards are on the table and it feels like I can be myself, and it feels like that information is out there if people want to find it. So they know what they're signing up for in many ways. And like, I feel really at peace with it now. And it's opened up a lot of vulnerability for other people to share how they're feeling and what they're going through. And I think that that's just brought me in alignment to
Absolutely.
Definitely. Can we talk about actually, it's not just you, because it is really interesting, kind of the conclusion that you come to, well, very early on in the book, that mental health isn't an individualized issue. It's, there are all sorts of systemic pressures and environmental pressures kind of weighing down on it. And you came to the conclusion that, like, that's one of the tenets, isn't it? That it's not just you, that you weren't like responsible. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the title in and of itself has multiple meanings, and I think the way that the book unfolds as it tries to start at a sort of microcosmic level and then expand out to looking at the systemic underpinnings of mental health illness in a time of climate change. And far too often in society, we are made to feel solely responsible and ashamed for the mental health struggles that we have. And I don't deny like the importance of biological elements and genetic stuff and hereditary conditions. That's not to undermine that. But I do think that given the current paradigm of what we're living through at the moment, the rate at which mental health illness, if you want to call it that, is proliferating cannot be explained by the individual alone. I mean, we're living through a climate crisis. We lived through a pandemic, which was a time of deep isolation, and so many people lost loved ones during that period of time. There's financial instability, the rise of fascism, we're living through genocides. I mean, there's so much that's happening. I honestly feel like anyone who has a semblance of sanity in a world living through a time such as now, I would almost really question that. I'm like, how are you not reflecting what the world is putting out? So I think that's quite an important conversation because, as I've mentioned, living in this neoliberal capitalist society, we are essentially told time and time again that it is our fault that we are unwell. It goes hand in hand with this capitalist ideology of individual success and meritocracy. And that's reflected in the way that people are told that, it's their biology that's making them unwell, or that they're just simply not like taking care of themselves well enough, because it's so easy to deflect blame instead of actually looking at the system that is full of inequality. Like, stable housing is mental health care, having food to eat, having a job, all of these things that are fundamental to human well-being are completely thrown out of the question when it comes to talking about mental health. And yet we're told to go on medication and we're told to tackle things using therapy. By all means, these are tools and things that I use, but you can't simply just talk about mental health without looking at the environment that you're placed in. We are very much a product of our environments. And I think that it's a disservice as well to the climate conversation with conversations like eco-anxiety, where far too often we're told it's our fault. And I'm like, well, we're not directly responsible for the climate crisis. It's not just an individual issue. This is a systemic issue, and therefore it warrants a systemic approach to how we address it.
Yes, Maya Rose, what do you have an answer to that? What do you think about?
I mean, I completely agree in every way. I think all of my closest friends who are kind of in any way politically active are also very distressed at all times. And I completely think those go hand in hand. And I'd add also, I've been kind of in this space for like 11 or 12 years now, and the amount of people I've met who have been these like amazing, passionate, dynamic people, and then they've disappeared, and I've never seen them again because they have completely exhausted themselves and giving everything to try and make the world a slightly better place, and which is, you know, why I think conversations like these are so important. And it's just yeah, I completely agree, and I don't really know what the answer is apart from community, I suppose, but that's not really a solution. But I think kind of, I don't know, trying as hard as possible to kind of stay together and support one another and try and make it a tiny bit easier is really, really important.
I completely agree with that.
You talk about collective care, don't you, Tori, in your book? So is that kind of like some sort of an antidote to that feeling of isolation and burnout as well?
Yeah,
Maya Rose was talking about the community.
definitely. Again, this neoliberal capitalist society sets us up to live very individualized lives, which deeply impacts our mental well-being. And humans are social creatures, we know this. And when you put people in a situation where they're effectively separated from their own humanity, that's only going to result in ill health, whatever ill health means to you. And community care is such a fundamental tenet of the book. And I think part of the reason is because it's so antithetical to everything that we have been indoctrinated to believe because of the systems that we have been born into. And I draw a lot from this amazing book called The Care Manifesto, which talks about this idea of promiscuous care, which is that care does not need to be, scarce. It doesn't need to be limited to just one person or type of person alone. Like, it can be free, it can be shared amongst different people. And I think that actually one thing I'd like to challenge is that community care is really glamorized, and it is a very beautiful thing. And I've received so much beautiful community care. I have a wonderful community, friends, comrades alike, but it can also be very hard. Community care doesn't always just mean caring for your friends. It can mean caring for people who don't see eye to eye to you, and caring for people who might not necessarily be within your sort of immediate circle. It means expanding that notion of care, caring for people for humanity's sake. And I think that we need to actively challenge this narrative that care has to be scarce, because scarcity mindset is what's driving us off the cliff edge and alienating us from one another. And so it was really important to imbue the sense of like what it means to be collective in the book as not only something that we should aspire to, but also really highlight it's not always easy, but it is so much better than being isolated and being alone and living a life that is destroying ourselves and destroying the planet.
I'd like to add as well, just quickly, it reminds me of a post that was going back a while ago, and around a while ago, and it was talking about how if we want community, we have to allow ourselves to be annoyed and to deal with like rude people and irritating people, and that we're not going to always protect our peace, and like that's the sacrifice we make for having community and caring for people in our lives. And I think that's really, especially kind of in this kind of modern neoliberal individualistic, like remembering that people are allowed to not always be perfect, and it's sometimes going to make your life more difficult, but it's worth it. I think that's kind of the difficult bit that people forget sometimes.
Yes, the uncomfortable bit. Both of you talk about kind of the discomfort required for change. And I think you've kind of mentioned tonight, but I know also in both of your books you talk about kind of like uncomfortable conversations with certain demographics. Maya Rose, that makes me that brings me to your charity that you set up, Black to Nature. Could you tell us a bit about that and kind of what the reason was? Because I remember that you found yourself in a strange position as well, being a 14-year-old and being kind of consulted on sort of race within the environmental sector, which is quite a lot. It's quite a big thing to put on sort of a teenager. Could you tell us about why you founded that charity and maybe a bit of a story behind that?
Yeah. So I suppose as someone who is not white, and kind of grew up in the nature and environmental sector, that's something that I couldn't help but notice very obviously the older I got. both kind of from the white side of things, but all, you know, with saying like, oh, you know, there are just certain people who don't care about these things, don't engage with these things, and also from my Asian side with people going like, but why do you care about the environment? That's a white people thing. And I was like, I know they're all wrong because I exist and my mum and my sister and some other people I know exist. And so I found it this very frustrating thing, and very, very long story short, but I started running nature and environmental camps originally just to kind of meet and hang out with other kids my own age with the same hobbies. But when it turned into yet another example of like me and a bunch of white middle class boys, I was like, surely nature is more than this. Like it's not all just me and like future David Attenboroughs. And so it started this project where I wanted to bring specifically Black and Asian kids out into nature. And I called it Black to Nature, kind of in the more, I suppose these days, old-fashioned word of the old-fashioned use of the word Black that kind of included Asian people as well. And it was just about kind of diversity and giving a voice. But you're right, I kind of, when I first started, the goal wasn't to start a charity, it was just to go like, hey, I care about this and I think it's important. And I ended up writing to various environmental organizations, and like you said, they responded by asking like 13, 14-year-old me to come and give them advice. And I think that's something that I see over and over again to this day, that if you're like BME, you're immediately seen as an expert speaking for ethnic minority people and you know, supposed to be the voice of diversity or whatever. And even at the time I was like, this is ridiculous, I'm a child, I have no idea what I'm talking about. And that's kind of a battle that's been going on for a very long time in many, many different, or basically every space, I suppose. But I also remember, I think kind of that whole process, setting it up originally taught me a lot of like so many different lessons that I think really shaped me as a person. Like one that I think is one of the key ones I hold to this day was it taught me how to be annoying and it taught me how to be tenacious and have a voice. And I genuinely think those are the biggest skills I have now. Like a really cool memory after I set up the charity was I did this process where I help every CEO from the nature sector, and I sat down and I had a meeting with them, and I won't name them, but one of the charities, I could not get a response, I could not pin him down, and I found him at a conference and I cornered him and I had this conversation, and I've never seen a grown man try to run away from someone before. And it was, and I was about 14, and he so clearly did not want to talk to me. In the end, he retired about a year later, so he wasn't my problem. But it was like one of the first times I was like, oh my God, I'm talking to someone who does not want to talk to me, thinks I'm really annoying, like doesn't want to engage with what I'm talking about, and I just didn't care. And I think like, yeah, Tori's been laughing. Like I think it's such a life skill to speak even when someone doesn't want you to speak. And I think it also brings you kind of peace of mind as well, where you kind of don't care if people like I guess to go back to the trolls from the start as well, like you don't care as much if people like you or not because you kind of have belief in what you're talking about. And I think that's really, really important.
Tori, you're nodding there. I feel like you've got something to add.
Absolutely. Oh man, you spoke words right out of my head, which is that there is so much about being a disruptor that causes discomfort. And I think that people have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think that friction is one of the most beautiful things because it can make or break relationships and it can really show people that there is this like love in accountability. And when you're an activist, you get very used to kind of speaking your mind, speaking your truth. And we're in a lot of circles where accountability is a really important thing. And then when you start venturing outside of those spaces, you realize that people are very accustomed to seeing them as attacks, when for us, it's so often grounded in this belief that humans are capable of doing better. And that's a really interesting thing for me because, you know, I move through a lot of spaces in different industries. I meet a lot of people in my daily life, and more often than not, I try and meet them where they're at. But I will lovingly challenge people and I will say, like, hey, I think you can do better, or like, that's not great that you did this, or whatnot. And seeing the way that people respond to it can be very telling, I think, about like whether someone stands for justice or kind of sees things eye to eye with you. And you do have to make peace with the idea of people not liking you. I think so many of us are already brandished in such a negative light for our activism that we've had to develop a sort of like, outer skin that's quite resilient. But even so, just in the small minutiae of interactions where people don't agree with you or try and put you down, I've gotten kind of over it. I think I don't really care if people don't like me. Because I know that what I'm fighting for is so intrinsic to me, and I know who I am, and I'm rooted in myself, that if someone doesn't like what I have to offer, then that's on them. Though I will say, like, there are times where I find it tricky because all I want is to influence people and like create change in the world. And when people turn away from that, that for me is less of an issue of like, oh, they don't like me, and more of an issue of, oh gosh, like we need as many people as we can. We need all hands on deck. But then you do also learn to pour your energy into the communities that do care, into the people that do care, who are in alignment with you. And my God, it is one of the most beautiful things when you meet people who care as deeply about the planet as you do, care as deeply about society as you do. And it just sets your soul on fire. Like, it sounds cheesy, but genuinely. And I was actually speaking to Brian Eno about this, and he was just like, how amazing is it to care? Like, if you're someone who cares deeply and you're trying to fight for a better world, like, oh my God, that community is stunning. Like, the way it holds you, the way you feel like you have a purpose when you get up every morning, it's such a phenomenal feeling. And I would never trade that for the world. Like, I love the community that I'm part of, and I love the work that I do, and I get up every morning wanting to do it because I love it and I love the people that I work with. So
I love that so much. And I guess, I mean, you wouldn't have found them. Neither of you probably would have found them if you hadn't found your voice. And both of you found, like, you've clearly found your voices already. I wonder, we've probably got 5 minutes left until we're going to start taking some audience questions. But yeah, I really wanted to ask if there was a turning point when you talked about kind of the frustration, Maya, about like trying to get these CEOs to listen to you and the sort of tenacity that's needed. When do you both remember a turning point when you realize, yeah, people are starting to listen now? Was it just maybe it's just been a gradual sort of process of just carrying on going, perhaps, and just like building momentum? Maybe there wasn't a turning point.
I think for me, it's definitely been a gradual thing. But I think like probably one of the biggest turning points, like I was actually a very quiet kid and kind of very socially awkward and all that kind of stuff. And but also a kid who was kind of very deeply concerned about the state of the planet, which is one of the reasons I started posting about it online. And I think the biggest turning point for me actually as like an 11, 12-year-old was that people cared and they were interested in what I had to say, and that I gained an audience and people read it. And I think like for any child, for any young woman actually, realizing that you have a voice and people are interested in listening to your voice, I think that was in many ways kind of life-changing for me, and that's the springboard from which everything else I've done ever has come from, if that makes sense. And yeah, I think I'd be a very different person if I'd never kind of learnt that lesson at a very young age.
It takes courage though as well. So Tori, do you have anything you want to add before maybe we go to some audience questions?
such a great question. Like, was there a turning point? I think similar to Maya, there wasn't really a definitive turning point. It was something that happened gradually. I think I'd always been a very tenacious child, always very outspoken, was kind of that person who would be like, I don't agree with that. I don't think that's right. And I was stubborn and I was branded bossy as a kid. And yeah, maybe I was, but at the same time, I channeled all of those things into the work that I do now. And I think that for me, I won't deny that the sort of formative 2018 years, the rise of the youth climate movement, the rise of that climate consciousness definitely spurred me on. I'd always had an inclination towards environmentalism and did a lot of it at school and was very sort of vocal about these things in Hong Kong. But those years, 2018 to 19, just leading up to the pandemic, really kickstarted a lot of my public advocacy. I'd kind of done more quiet campaigning, but I think I'd kind of been thrust into the public eye in a very unconventional way. And I didn't shy away from it because I was just like, it's now or never. And I think those years really did create this sort of momentum where, you know, I realized that no, there are hundreds of thousands of people who believe in what I believe in, and we may be a small section of society, but that has the potential to catalyze something so much bigger than us. And yeah, the climate movement has ebbed and flowed, and I've spoken to some people who I really respect in the movement. We call them climate elders. They're like the people that we aspire to be. And one day Maya will be climate elders, which is such a wild thought to think. But one of them had said, look, movements always go through peaks and troughs. Make peace with that and know that it will be on the up again. Like, we are going through a trough at the moment, unfortunately, because of the nature of like the political climate, the way that you know, climate funding has been so scarce lately. But it will come up again, and when it does, it will come back harder than ever, and we'll be ready to fight. And that's something that I carry with me every day.
Thank you. And that makes me think of your kind of extended sort of mushroom analogy in your book, the, you know, the idea that kind of there's the fruiting mushroom and you guys are the fruiting mushrooms, and you've got the mycelial network, and, you know, kind of things die down and then they kind of rise again. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I mean, for anyone who's curious, the mushroom has always been such a fascinating nexus of like community and spontaneity and movement building, because I really draw from Rebecca Solnit's kind of commentary of Hope in the Dark, where, you know, below the surface there are these mycelial networks that don't seem visible to the naked eye, but then under the right conditions the spontaneity brings about the visibility. And I think that that speaks to the fact that there are these really integrated underground networks of activists who are waiting for that opportune moment to really spontaneously erupt and create change. And when you have that sort of you know, foundation, it does come and go like the visible mushroom, but it's always there. And so we're just waiting for the next moment where we can come together and, yeah, create a revolution, basically.
And that gives you strength. Maya, any last, do you have a comment on that before we go to the audience questions? No, you don't need to. We've actually got one for you here. We have from Mike. He's saying, My Rose, please share one top beautiful moment of your interaction with birds.
Oh, wow. Oh, very hard to choose.
Maybe a recent one. What about your 6,000th bird? If you can't think of, because there must be so many. What about
recent one? I'd say a very recent one actually is has just been watching the birds in my garden this spring. I think a lot of people, because I've seen a lot of bird speech, obviously, but like people kind of come to me and they go like, oh, you're so lucky, wildlife in the UK is so boring, and I'm like, no, it's beautiful and it's special, and we don't give it enough attention. And actually one of my greatest joys every spring is just kind of watching, you know, my local bird population thrive and breed and keeping track of nests. And I was thinking about this today actually, because during COVID there was this one kind of very stupid blackbird fledgling that just had no survival instincts and would sit in the middle of the lawn, and there were cats everywhere, and we never thought it would make it, and it would. And I was watching a blackbird fly around today and I was like, maybe it's that one. I don't know, but I love kind of just tracking things year by year, and it makes me feel very kind of grounded as well. To just be like, yeah, it's come again. Yeah.
I know that you've got like some favorite birds, like from reading Bird Girl, you know, you've got the hummingbird and then the harpy eagle and stuff like that, birds like that. What bird do you identify with, a particular bird? If you were to be a bird, which one would you choose, do you think?
I think someone told me this recently and they gave me a really rude answer. I can't remember what it was, but I was really offended. I think
A rude answer, how? Like a sort of like the lack of
just a
culture or something.
be told that they are, but I really can't remember what it was. I think if I was being deeply flattering to myself, I'd like to say like a crow or something. I think they're very fun.
I love corvids.
Like, I just think they're really, really cool birds. So that's probably projecting. Yeah. What about you, Tori? You know more about birds than you've let on.
I love birds. But yeah. Oh man, such a good question. I absolutely adore hummingbirds, and I saw a lot of them in Latin America. Um, so I have a very tender sort of spot for the colibri,
Yes.
but I really love bulbuls, and it's because they just have the most ridiculous hairdos. They have these like little mohawks. And I would watch them in my parents' garden in Hong Kong, and I always just found them so endearing and so cute. But I do also love blackbirds because they're such so ridiculous. Like when they're in the leaves and they're rustling, they're like throwing things around. They're just so comical. And I do love a Christmas robin. I just think they're so adorable. And when they puff their chests out, and they sing and they're so loud and they project.
It's a classic.
Yeah,
Robin's a classic.
and oh God, I can't pick it's like one bird. But yeah, I
Too
love
many.
all. There's so many.
We've got another question here. Thank you for this brilliant conversation. My question for both of you is, what stories do you think are missing from the climate conversation at this moment?
There are many stories, I think. Stories of those who are most marginalized or on the front lines of the climate crisis, who have traditional knowledge systems that are erased and not necessarily seen as superior. In fact, they're seen as inferior. I'd say the kind of stories that people wouldn't even consider climate stories because they're human-centered. I think that social justice still has, it's fundamental to the climate conversation, but it still has a way to go in terms of really cementing itself in the really, sort of mainstream climate narrative. I would also say, and this one might be a bit of a rogue one, I think humor. I know that sounds a bit left field, but it's like this is such a serious conversation so often, and there's so much about the climate conversation that feels really heavy and really depressing. And I think we have to expand our creativity to find ways to talk about it that reaches new audiences. And I think humor could be really powerful in that regard. And then with that, I guess, comes the conversation of like, how do we actually integrate climate storytelling into the mainstream to the point where we don't even call it climate, it just becomes like part of everyday storytelling. So yeah, those are the things that I think about when you ask that question.
Yeah.
You're nodding your head. Have you got something to?
Yeah. I mean, I agree with all of that, absolutely. And I guess kind of all of that more, I'd say like for me, the very, very key story that we kind of barely seem to brush on sometimes is kind of that intrinsic relationship between people and nature, which I think often is highlighted in terms of the stories of kind of indigenous people and nature and climate, the way that humans are very often removed from environmental narratives. You have people saying like, oh, I wish we could just get rid of people so the planet could thrive. And it's like, no, we are part of nature as well. And this isn't about kind of separating us and creating like a national park over there and then cities here. It's about creating this kind of sustainable, collaborative relationship with nature, which I think is one of the reasons that people are interested in kind of looking towards indigenous relationships with nature, kind of without falling into the noble savage tribe. Most communities around the world have succeeded at having a very healthy relationship with nature for a long time, which is then when you get into relationships of like consumption and capitalism. But I'd say also that I suppose what I'm trying to say is it's not about creating some untouched landscape, and that humans have always curated the landscape. In the UK, that's very, very obvious. It used to be covered in forest, but even in the Amazon rainforest, that in many areas is essentially a farm where things have been curated and planted in shapes, and how other species are able to thrive. So I suppose what I'm saying is, like, I think the key story in all of this is healing that relationship with nature and finding a way to go forward together. And maybe like the big final boss is capitalism or colonialism or something like that, but all of them, I suppose. But yeah,
Both of you just touched on kind of indigenous communities there, which is kind of something that both of you campaign for. And I think it is really interesting, like Tori, what you say in It's Not Just You, kind of you write about animism and, kind of how Western sort of frameworks of philosophy kind of have severed us a little bit from nature. What do you both think we could learn from? I mean, there's so much to learn, obviously, from Indigenous communities, but what do you think we can learn in that respect from them?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the knowledge that we can learn is boundless, really. There's so much, but if we start on the topic of something like animism, just understanding that we are nature, and speaking to some of my friends who come from Indigenous communities, many of them don't even have a word for nature because it's just not seen as separate. And that for me is really interesting. And then also a lot of Indigenous communities have multiple words for different forms of natural elements, like the word for snow. There's so many different types of snow, for instance, that a lot of Sami people use. Or, when they name rivers and they name lakes in a way that humanizes them, gives them this sort of like persona. Because when you see something, and I use the word nature and the natural world in this sort of way just to illustrate the point, when you see something in the natural world that is personified, it's so much easier to find relatedness and to also see your responsibility to it. Because I think that far too often this Western ontology of hierarchy has separated us from the natural world, and what that has done is ultimately severed our own connection to what is fundamentally part of us. And we have a saying in the climate movement that we are not fighting for nature, we are nature fighting for itself, essentially fighting for survival. And I think that couldn't be, more on the nose with what we actually need to do, which is recalibrate our relationship to the natural world, to the world that we live in, so that we can understand what it means to be interconnected and to have this sort of really embodied relationship with the place that we call home.
Absolutely. Thinking about the kind of wisdom from Indigenous traditions, obviously later this year it's COP30. I understand I might be incorrect in this, but I think that Indigenous rights and the Amazon and sort of biodiversity is going to be forefront of the agenda. What are your hopes for COP30? What are your concerns? Like with Maya Rose, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'd say the only climate COP I've attended was COP27, was it, in Glasgow? And I left early, actually. I found it to be an incredibly demoralizing experience that actually it ended up really severely affecting my mental health for a while afterwards. Like very badly, and which is one of the reasons I haven't attended a climate change COP since. And I think part of that is because each time a COP happens, it kind of offers a moment of hope for me. And I think this is one of my bigger issues with climate change, is that it's not some scientific mystery, it's not some political mystery. We know basically exactly what we need to do in every direction to solve it, and it's just not being done. And so I think it's a really positive step that Indigenous voices are being prioritized in this way. And I try and stay optimistic for these things, because I think that every year does, like I said, it does offer a really important moment. But at the same time, I think partially, and I do want to change this, but I think in the last year or two, I've kind of downsized a lot of my day-to-day campaigning and conversations kind of for the sake of my own mental health. I used to talk a lot more about saving the world, and it kind of drained me completely, and I do want to return to that. But kind of, I mentioned community earlier, and I think in a lot of ways, kind of every single community project around the world being offered another 2 degrees of support would make a massive difference. This might all be coming from partially, I was at Biodiversity COP last autumn, and I was there for a week, and they just didn't finish the negotiations, which I didn't know was allowed. But they just didn't finish. They finished it about 6 months later. So I actually can't remember what the question was. I'm so sorry. But those are some thoughts.
No, that's
We can have
fascinating.
them, but yeah.
No, it's just about kind of hope for COP30 and what I'm hearing.
Yeah, there is hope as well. Sorry, yeah, there are lots of opportunities always, because that's the whole point. Is that, like I said, there's lots and lots of stuff that can be done.
Yes.
It's just about it being done.
But there's a sense of disillusionment as well sometimes with these kind of big negotiations. I understand that. There's one question, one perhaps last question from the audience. Tori, did you want to add to that, anything to that before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I just want to second what Maya was saying about like feeling quite disheartened after COPs. But I think because there is so much about this upcoming COP, which is centered on, you know, indigenous peoples and folks from the Latin American region, which has shown such resistance and fighting for social change, that is really inspiring. I mean, eco-socialism is born out of Ecuador. We have leftist government in Colombia, in Brazil. Like Latin America, time and time again has shown us like what it means to enact change and to organize from the like resistance side of like people ground up indigenous resistance, and that I find really inspiring. So I'm hoping that is the ethos at the COP.
Thank you. So from Håkan in Swindon, how do you deal with climate guilt when it feels, and he says, well, to him anyway, impossible to live perfectly, sustainably? It's a good question.
I love this question because it's literally what my next book is all about.
Ooh, yeah, perfect.
So I have a book that I'm writing, which is all about this concept of bad activism. And it was an organization that I started with some friends a few years ago. And it's basically a play off of Roxane Gay's Bad Feminist, which is that we are inherently perfect by virtue of being human, and also that it is impossible to be perfect in an imperfect society. And I think I don't frame it as like making peace with my imperfections. I think I just reroute my attention to like where I can create change and recognize that the system is set up against me. And that, you know, if we take the fossil fuel industry, for instance, we all know the classic example of BP coining the term carbon footprint, which has been used as a marketing campaign to deflect from consumers' responsibility. And when you start to see the many ways in which these big industries have been insidiously peddling these rhetorics to convince us that we are the issue, we start to realize that nitpicking at our individual behaviors is futile. We can only do what we can do, and actually perhaps collectively organizing to challenge these industries that make it impossible for us to be perfect is perhaps the best use of our energy. And I think that, yeah, it's not a matter of making peace with my imperfections entirely, but it's about redirecting my energy I'm spending on kind of nitpicking, on trying to create systems change.
Yeah. My Rose, do you have anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of thoughts, always. I'd say, there's so much going on there. I'd say, firstly, that one of the weaknesses of kind of liberal or leftist or left-wing spaces always has been discourse, and the amount of really impressive groups of people or organizations or whatever that have fallen apart because of discourse and because people aren't perfect, and they kind of there's an infighting and all of that kind of stuff. And it's like you said, it's this idea of kind of the bad activists, and I feel like that historically has kind of not been allowed in certain spaces, at least. And I think that that's actually one of the biggest weaknesses. And on top of that, I try my best, but also I think often, and I agree with everything Tori said, and everything to do with the kind of systemic capitalist corporate deal. Again, we all know the stat where it's like, what's it, 71% of all carbon emissions are because of like 100 companies. But I'd say on top of that, I think even within our own lives, the things that we focus on or are told to focus on are kind of the least important. You know, it's the things like, did I ride my bike today? When actually, if people do actually want things to change, I say think about your wider social impact. And the one I mentioned to a lot of people is think about who you are banking with, and think about where your investments and where your pension money is going, because money is more important than anything. And even if you look at kind of apartheid in in South Africa, one of the key student movements was stopping people banking with Barclays, who are consistently awful. They're awful today.
Yeah.
And so I'd say, like, if people do want to kind of feel a bit better with that environmental guilt, it's not about the little things, it's about your money, and seeing if your money is being invested in climate change or in genocide or in 1,000 other terrible things. So if that's one thing I want people to take away from today, is like, change your banks, have a look at your investments.
Yes, and that for eco guilt, like, we can all do our bit, but then there are kind of bigger factors at play. Yeah.
Which is why joining together is so important. Do your bit for the movement, etc. So yeah.
Oh, thank you. We're at time now. So I was going to ask you if there's anything what's the one thing you want the audience to go away with? Maya, I think you just answered that. Tori, is there one last thing that you'd like to leave the audience with before we say goodbye?
Oh, that's hard. But I mean, the thing that automatically came to my mind is just find your people, find the people who care, find the people who create, a feeling of belonging and care as deeply about this cause as you do, because we're so much stronger when we work together.
Thank you so much to both of you. That was fascinating. And I really look forward to seeing what you do next. Thank you for joining us. Good night. Good night, everybody. Thank you very much for coming.
Hey, thank you.